What's going on, everyone? I'm Rhett Shull. Welcome to Rhett Shull Studio. In this video, I've got both of my full-length interviews with Josh Scott of JHS Pedals and Dan Steinhardt from That Pedal Show. Both of these guys have a huge love and affinity for the Vox AC30, and it really comes through in these interviews. So I'm not going to waste any time. We're going to get straight into the interviews. Before we get started, a quick plug. This is Rhett Shull Studio. This channel is going to be where my Backstage Journal podcast lives. It's going to be more long-form interviews like this, and it's going to be a place for more technical videos like in-depth how-to recording tips, mixing tips, how I make my videos for the main channel. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, be sure to subscribe down below and ring the bell. I also do weekly live streams over here called Sound Check. So if you're interested in that, be sure to subscribe. Without further ado, let's get into the interviews with Dan and Josh.
Well, for 64, what you see on the top of your unit, you've still got the small vent holes, and they changed that pretty quickly because it's a design flaw in the amplifier because they get really hot. And they pretty soon went to the wider vents. But yeah, with those Silver Bulldog speakers, and yeah, man, it looks like an absolute corker. The first ones were black panel, and they had an EF86 channel as well, which is, if you think of a matchless DC30, it's the same preamp tube that they use for the gainier type thing. So EF86 has much higher gain level, and they're a very special preamp valve, but they are also very temperamental. And they replace that essentially with the top boost circuit, which still uses a 12AX7, but then you have the bass and treble. Originally, those circuits were like a module that would be fitted to the back panel. And that's what I've got in my 62. So that's copper top boost circuit added to the back. But I've also had an EF86 circuit in mine as well. Your amp has the treble boost circuit integrated into the top panel. So that's one of the features of when they went from the copper top to the grey panel, that they made the top boost channel part of the amplifier. Right.
And so that would be like the brilliant input top.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. It's the channel and the sound, I guess, that it's most well known for. But my favorite sound in the amplifier is the normal channel. The normal channel turned up is absolutely magic. Not having that tone stack in there, it's so open, and it is just the most incredible pedal platform. So my amp's been used on like loads of sessions. I took it to a recording session for Biffy Clyro a couple of years ago, and I think it's on most of the album.
Wow.
And it's really interesting because we had probably 6 amplifiers, like all set up in the room that we plug into, and we had high watts and Marshalls and amazing array of classic amplifiers, and we would mix and match and have all these multiple things. But whenever the AC30 was taken out of the mix, something felt lacking in the control room. And so, yeah, I think it's on about 90% of balance, not symmetry. Yes. So as far as recording amplifiers are concerned, they are extraordinary. It doesn't take a whole lot to get them wound up. Basically, they're loud amplifiers to a point. So you hear a lot of people complaining how loud an AC30 is. But then it doesn't get much louder than that. As soon as you get to that optimum clean headroom, you're just dialing in more limiting, and you get that incredible power amp saturation.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah,
yeah. It's very, very special.
It's funny, because I got mine home yesterday and turned it up for the first time and really got it. And you're right. And that is a characteristic of once you get above, I think, like 20 watts in an amp, that you get loud, and then the volume doesn't increase, but that gain and the amount of clipping that's coming through the circuit starts to increase. And it is way louder than a modern AC30 from what I could initially tell. And it breaks up in a completely different way. My biggest problem with the modern AC30s that I've played, and to be fair, most of the modern ones that I've played were backline amps that were clapped out and beaten to hell. But the top end of a modern AC30 is not the same as that. That has a very like when people describe chimey, I think that's what they're talking about. I think the Matchless does that really well. You know?
It does. I think so. One of the biggest things in that sound is those speakers. I've got the original 62 Blues, and you've got the Bulldogs, and they're early Bulldogs, and they are, man, they just don't sound like that anymore. You know, you need to. There are so many things to take into account. We're talking briefly the other day about the cathode resistor being specified for the valves that you could buy back in 1964, which are very different to the valves that you can buy today.
Mm-hmm.
The output transformers are different, and you go and have a look at the way that amplifier is made. Who's making amps like that now? And actually the interesting thing about the AC30, there are some like the lead dress and stuff, there are some things that amplify that could be improved on, which actually started Matchless. So Mark
Sampson
and Phil Jamison back in the day when they started Matchless, it was, we got all these guys who are touring with these AC30s and they're breaking on the road. Okay, what can we do to make this amplifier more robust? Matchless is born. So you look at the schematics from a DC30 and an AC30, and they are so similar.
Right. But
the way it's built is just to make it more robust. But to take nothing away from, the you look at the old mustard caps and the way they those old boards and stuff they use, and it really is. Anyone that can do that sort of manufacturing today is a labour of love. You look at that and you think, man, the amount of work and effort that's gone into creating this, and also, the most important thing, apart from the way that the amp sounds, because it's mega, but it is such a piece of history. The tones that came from these amplifiers changed the world. And every time I plug into that amplifier and just, play like a sus chord, it's like, I'll never sound like George or John to that amplifier, but there's a characteristic about an AC30 that is so intrinsic to that music. And it just reminds me that how important that stuff is.
Dude, I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah, it was the vehicle that carried those tones and those songs that changed the world. It's magic.
It really is, man. It really is. Like, you think about the time, you think about the place, London, early 60s, Dick Denny and Tom Jennings, the guys, like they were figuring this stuff out. Like, no one had done this before. And like specifically that area of Denmark Street with Macari's and all that stuff. Like, what a place, man. What a time, that literally shifted the future, the cultural future of Western art forever. You know what I mean? From that one little spot.
Man, we did a video with Anthony Macari and with Josh, actually, when he was over here at Macari's. And, he was pulling out receipts for transistors from 1964. and pulling out original tone benders and stuff. It's like pulled out what we believe to be the prototype for the fuzz face.
Oh my god!
You know, it's for a geek. It is, it's Mecca. It's that area of London where so much is happening. You know, you go past the on Denmark Street where David Bowie had his ambulance where he'd park outside where we were living in for a while, and you know, so much was happening in that area, in that part of London, not just musically, but you know, when these guys were creating these amplifiers, and it hadn't been done before, you know. And so that creative energy wasn't just going into the artistic output, it was going into how can we take these artists and project their sound, you know. So it's fun, it's so funny, like when you look at the Beatles live at Shea Stadium, and you see the amps and things they're using, there was no monitors then. And they had these tiny, tiny little PA systems. And they're playing their hearts out. They couldn't hear a thing they were doing. And you think of the way the technology has changed now when you go to see a gig, and it's just like, you know, the production value and everything. You know, you go back to when the Beatles were doing their thing, the biggest band in the world, and they had these tiny, you know, yeah, it was just, you could see how this music had hit, and then you see something like that and you realize, okay, we've got to push this technology so that we can get these thousands of people that want to come and see these artists to be heard. And that's why, you know, there was the AC15, then the AC30, and the AC50. It was just a race to get louder, you know. And then Marshalls come along, and you have these 100-watt amplifiers, and it was just, you know, that whole push to be louder. And I think accidentally we have these tones because of that. Mm-hmm. You know, you hear some of these incredible recordings from Zeppelin back in the day, and there's no guitar in the front of house. You know, it's all coming off the stage, but it is so awesome and so loud. You know, but that's because of the technology and because of the way that the PAs and everything were, the amps had to evolve that way. Now right. It's shifting. But the AC30, an evolution of the AC15, because they were just trying to push it, get, you know, more and more.
Yeah, and it does a thing.
I get really, really passionate about this stuff, and I'll waffle on. So please,
no, that's why
as much as you like.
That's why I called you. So you're right, though. There's this thing, though, that happens, and we see it come up all the time nowadays in the sort of real amp versus fake amp debate, which just drags on and on online forever and always will, I think. But I think there is something that happens with that amp being 30 watts, which, man, that's probably the loudest 30-watt amp I've ever heard. I mean, I'm a big Divided by 13 fan, and Fred's amps I think are massively underrated in terms of their output power, because that's 37 watts supposedly, but there's no way in hell it's actually 37 watts. Same thing with the AC30. What happens is when you start to push that amp and you get those speakers moving and you get that cabinet moving, there's this I call it the thud, where as soon as you, like, the transient of the note comes through, as soon as your pick falls off that string, it's this concussive thing that hits you in the chest that happens when you have higher powered amps, moving speakers, moving air, that I think is really, really important, because at that point the amplifier becomes part of the instrument and the way it's reacting with the guitar and the guitar's pickups in the room. It's important.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Now what's a really interesting thing about the AC30 and why it seems so loud is that it has very little bass response. And if you think of the amount of energy it takes to move bass frequencies, the AC30 doesn't waste any of those energies on bass frequencies. It's all mids. So it can use all of that 30 watts in just, you know, some low mids for sure, but there's no sub frequencies. Nothing's lost down there. All the energy is going to frequencies that, as a guitar player, they're the frequencies that we want to hear, and they're the frequencies that are going to help us sit in the mix. You know, when you hear Brian May talk about when he first heard a loud AC30 and how he was searching for this thing that would create these violin-like tones, and they are those tones and frequencies that we talk with. And so, you know, he heard that and he knew he'd found it, you know, and that's to me, that is the genius of the AC30, because none of that power is wasted. You know, you get a 100-watt Marshall, and there are many 100-watt Marshalls that aren't as loud as good AC30, because so much of that energy is going into producing low frequencies. But yeah, nothing is wasted in the AC30.
That's really interesting. I've never thought of it like that, but you're totally right. And when you think about too, like the natural response of a guitar speaker, it's not voiced to produce 120 hertz or 80 hertz or 50 hertz or whatever. And even if the output transformer is pushing that frequency, the speaker's not going to respond that way. And I also think too, those speakers are so well matched to that circuit.
Of course, yeah, absolutely, because it is, you know, it is such an important part of the design. As you know, from, you know, you talk to any amp designer, and the speaker choice is so fundamental to the way that the amp sounds, but the way that the amp is designed. So, you know, if you've got your you know, filter capacitors on the output of the AC30, if you make them too big, then you start to lose a lot of that energy. So yeah, no, it's just all part of that, the brilliance of that design. You know, they just they knew that the speakers they had in the day, those 15 watt-hour Nico speakers, and they knew the you know, the frequency response. And they said, okay, so this is where we need to cut those frequencies off. But you know, another really cool thing about those designs is they did it all by ear. You know, I mean, they did have scopes and things, but a lot of the time it was, they would just sit down and tweak it and go, yeah, no, that sounds right. You know, there's a famous stories about in the 70s when the Fender guys came in and built the Silverface amplifiers, and they made everything on the scope look perfect, and they're great clean amplifiers, but then people wanted that natural sort of harmonic unevenness of the old blackface amplifiers because it was just more harmonically pleasing. Yeah, but the old AC30s, they're you know, once they tweaked it by ear, you know, yeah.
I love it, man. So on the speakers, what's the difference between the Blues and the Bulldogs? Do you know?
Very little. I think if you probably, you know, looking at the spec of them, it's one of those things where they are, you know, technically so similar, and yet there is a difference. The Bulldogs are my favorite speaker. Incredibly hard to find. Okay, let me reframe that. The Blue is my favorite speaker. However, the best AC30s I've ever heard have had the Bulldogs in them. You know, so yeah, they're very special.
Yeah, so don't blow one of those up, is what you're saying.
No. And to find, if you blow one up, to find someone that, I blew up one of my original speakers, and I went to 4 guys before I found a guy who could recone it properly. You know, there's an art form to that. Mm-hmm. You know,
yeah. There's a guy here in Atlanta. There's a guy, Jeff Bakos, who's like, he's like the wizard. You know, he's the tone amp repair wizard kind of thing. He used to work on consoles and stuff here in town. He's like the guy that I've already, whenever that amp needs work or any of my older stuff needs work, it goes straight to him because he knows, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nice.
Awesome.
Dan, this has been great, man. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My absolute pleasure. I'm happy to waffle on about this stuff. as long as you have to leave the camera rolling.
All these people
okay.
keep interrupting, Rhett. I'm joking. It's casual. This is casual Wednesday. Oh man, I don't have my coconut water. I do, however, have a severed hand. I had an employee get out of control, and
It's kind of like coconut water if you think about it.
yeah,
You know?
it's not creepy at all. No, I love this subject. I have been like fully into this time frame, writing about it and stuff. So Vox, little backstory, which you probably know most of this. So Vox kind of, the AC15 comes out in 58. 59 is the AC30. And Vox, I think it's important that we understand they're just a music shop. Like Jennings, what the crap was that? Vox is a guy named Tom Jennings, and on Charing Cross Road. So when you went to Macari's, that's not the original spot, but it's right down the street. If you go up the street there towards a Chipotle, there's actually a furniture store, and in that big glass front, we're talking like 30-second walk up the street, that was Vox, and it was a guy named Tom Jennings, and there was an engineer named Dick Denny, and they were kind of making organs, and they started putting the Vox name on it. They had these amps, the AC15 and 58. 59 was the AC30. And the whole London thing was about to basically explode. So, yeah, it's just that whole Denmark Street, Soho, Tin Pan Alley, London vibe. And they're just a small shop, really. Just like Macari's was a family shop. The next door to that was Selmer, where like Jimmy Page bought one of his guitars and a fuzz. Orange was next door to that. I mean, it's like, I can't even, like, I get giddy. Like, I wish if I could time travel, I could either see dinosaurs or that. I would go see that.
Dude, literally in my last video, the woman tone video, I said the exact same thing. If I could time travel, I'd go to London, 1966 to 68.
66 would be, I mean, for real. Hey, Josh, I have a time machine. I've worked on it to save humanity. Josh, you could actually solve the Kennedy assassination. What do you want to do? I want to go to Denmark Street, 1965. Why do you want to do that? Because they made like fuzz pals and stuff.
Dude, you're not wrong. I'm right there with you.
Yeah, so, and the Beatles, so at this time, let's go to like 63, because 63 is a good year. 1 year before this, in America, the first pedal ever is released. 1962, from Kalamazoo, Michigan, the Maestro Fuzztone FZ1. So, and now it's 63, and a couple of those have made it over to England. Remember, there's no Amazon Prime. There's no Sweetwater rep calling you to ask you if your strap fits. These people have had to, you ever had that happen? These people have had to bring it over. So we see, there's pictures of like early Beatles sessions in that period. I think Revolver maybe. There's like an FZ1 at John Lennon's feet. So some people have them, and Vox is popular. The Shadows, I think, are using Vox amps. The Beatles are getting big. They're playing like the nightclubs in Germany. They're coming into London. They're playing Paris. But they're not the Beatles. I'm actually reading this book now, which is fascinating. It's a guy that traveled with them before 1964. And I think that's important because the Beatles weren't always the Beatles. And this Vox amp that you have, it's like a really cool, I don't know, it's just, I love the feel. It's like you, we're nerds, and it's like the feeling of what it was like. I think we get obsessed with that, or I do. But you have Jennings sitting there in London not knowing what's about to happen to him. And what's about to happen is these Beatles that come into town, and they're kind of a big thing. They're using Vox amps, and they start trying to break through into America. And they'd been on a NBC program in 63. But in 64, February 7th, 1964, they go on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they arrive in America, and it's like the British invasion met by 4,000 people. They go to it's in a Broadway theater now. It's just that old Ed Sullivan building. They go in there, a few hundred people get to watch them live. 75 million people watch them on a TV screen. So you like picture the 1960s wholesome Leave It to Beaver families sitting around in the floor with the black and white TV and the bunny ears. 75 million people. And when you back off of that and think about the guitar influence, like I can't tell you how many people I've asked, what made you want to play guitar? The owner of Dan Electro now, Paul Gilbert. I mean, just like tons of people refer to, you know, these situations where their parents told them about that experience with the Beatles or they actually witnessed it. That was monumental. And so literally overnight, Vox went from mom and pop to like, oh my God, everybody wants a Vox amp. Because the Beatles, they had been using the AC30s and the Vox had supplied them with 50s for the shows. Everybody sees the Vox logos. And this amp you have, to me, it's like, that's like such a sacred year because that's where everything went nuts. And also the year after is important. So for framing in the event, the year after 1965, I think that's where like the 60s that we think of started. And I think that has to do with a lot of things, but Bob Dylan at Newport Folk going electric, that's kind of his middle finger to folk music as it was. And the Beatles coming along in 64 showed everyone that you can play a guitar, no keyboard needed, and you can have a band and people can love you. And Dylan had been this folk god. They bring him back to New York, to Newport. He releases Bringing It All Back Home, and the A side right before Newport is all electric. And people are like, what is he doing? I don't know if I like this. The B side was still acoustic. Well, he goes to Newport and he says, hey, we're plugging in all electric. People are booing him off the stage. And then he releases Highway 61. So 1965 is when the 60s starts. Like rock and roll and folk music. Folk music was no more. It was just rock and roll. And the Beatles helped with that, the British invasion. It's an insane time. 63 before the amp, if you want to go like super Ken Burns, Kennedy's assassinated. You had the Vietnam War. Like this period is insane. Like that's why I would want to time travel there. Everything about 64 is such a pivotal start. 65 also is the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction. So that causes Fuzz to finally be successful after 3 years of horrible no sales for that FZ1 fuzz pedal. The Stones released that song and everyone wants to hear fuzz. Everybody wants to hear electric. They saw the Beatles. They're hearing the Stones. 65, Macari's Next Door to Jennings, ironically, releases the Tone Bender. It's bonkers, dude. Yeah, like that amp built by those women in the factory, the showroom right there where the furniture store is. I remember like Anthony telling me, we walked down the street and he was like, literally the Beatles pulled up here in a van and would jump out through a crowd and run inside of what's now the furniture store. And was, you know, that amp, that's the year. It's crazy.
It's so crazy, man.
So crazy. And it's crazy what that amp was right on the edge of, like historically. Again, 64, that amp is like the last straw of anything reserved holding on musically. By 65, it's full on bonkers. And even further, I mean, the 60s are wild, but if you just think about your amp to 1969, think about Beatles, Ed Sullivan, you know, Love Me Do, cute little harmonica break. 69, Hendrix, Star Spangled Banner, Woodstock. That's 5 years. That is the craziest 5 years ever. And your amp is right. Your amp is like, we're holding on, and it can't hold on anymore. Yeah.
So you think that amp, that year, that amp effectively was essentially the straw that broke the back and sort of helped usher in the era of rock and roll as we know it today.
Yeah, I think that amp symbolically and for what it sounds like and does, it is one of the biggest straws that broke the camel's back. Like, you know, fuzz a year later becoming really prevalent, but that Beatles thing, the Vox thing, it's crazy. It's crazy what happened that year. 64, 65.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we got it. I think that's going to be, I'm going to stop recording here.